"Ma, figure it out alone." Those were the last words Robert said before slamming the gate and driving away, leaving Margaret, 72 years old, abandoned on the farm. His sister Sarah didn't even look back. Two people she'd raised by herself after losing her husband at 29 decided to throw away their own mother like she was nothing but a burden. But what happened next? Nobody saw it coming. A transformation so powerful, it reached all the way to the city, into her children's ears, and they discovered a truth that changed everything forever. What Margaret built on that abandoned farm didn't just save her, it exposed what her children had become. And when they finally came crawling back, broken and desperate, they found something that made them fall to their knees. This is the story of how one woman turned the cruelest abandonment into the most powerful comeback anyone in 3 counties had ever seen. The old metal gate slammed shut, with a sound that echoed across the empty fields like a gunshot. Dust rose in thick clouds, swirling in the late afternoon sun, settling slowly on everything. The cracked driveway, the weathered fence posts, the silence that fell heavy as stone. Margaret stood on the porch, her 72-year-old hands trembling against the faded fabric of her apron, the one she'd sewn herself 20 years ago, back when her hands were steadier, when the house was full of voices and laughter and the smell of Sunday dinner cooking on the stove. "Figure it out alone, Ma." Her son's voice still hung in the air, cold and final. Robert hadn't even looked back when he said it, just climbed into that shiny truck of his, the one he'd been so proud to show off last Christmas, and slammed the door. Her daughter Sarah sat in the passenger seat, eyes lowered, staring at her phone like it held the answers to all of life's questions. She'd barely said goodbye, just a quick kiss on the cheek that felt more like duty than love, and then she was gone too, chasing after her brother, chasing after that city life she wanted so desperately. The engine roared, tires crunched on gravel, and then they were gone. Margaret's old dog, Rusty, paced nervously at her feet, whimpering softly, sensing something broken in the air. The lantern on the porch swung gently in the breeze, creaking on its rusty chain, the only sound now in the terrible quiet that had descended on the farm. She closed her eyes and whispered, barely louder than the wind, "Lord, hold me up." The dust was still settling, and somewhere deep inside her chest, Margaret wondered, when everything falls away, what's left? Ruin, or something deeper, something with roots that go down to places abandonment can't reach. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, like a bruise spreading across the horizon, and Margaret was alone. Night fell on the farm like a curtain dropping on an empty stage. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching the last traces of daylight fade behind the distant hills, then turned and walked into the dark house. The crickets were singing their evening song, loud and relentless. Above her head, the old shingles creaked with every gust of wind, groaning like they were tired of holding on. Rusty had finally settled by the fireplace, his grey muzzle resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but watching her. She moved through the room slowly, her fingers trailing along the walls she'd touched 1,000 times before. The kitchen table sat there in the shadows, 4 chairs around it. 4 chairs, but tonight only one would be used. Margaret pulled out her chair, the one closest to the stove where she'd sat for 40 years, and lowered herself down with a soft sigh. Her knees weren't what they used to be. Nothing was what it used to be. On the counter, a dish towel hung from a hook. She'd embroidered it herself when the kids were small, stitching their names in blue thread, Robert and Sarah. Her hands had been so steady back then. The letters were perfect, each one a little prayer sewn into fabric. Now those names felt like ghosts. A memory flashed through her mind, sudden and sharp. Robert and Sarah as children, running barefoot through the yard, laughing so hard they could barely breathe. Summer evenings when the fireflies came out, and the world seemed full of magic and possibility. Their voices echoing across the fields, calling, "Mama, Mama, watch this." But now there was only silence, only echo. Her eyes moved to the wall where a picture frame hung crooked. It was a photo from 10 years ago. Robert, Sarah, and her late husband Tom, all smiling at a church picnic. The frame had been knocked sideways somehow, probably weeks ago, and she'd never bothered to fix it. Margaret stood, walked over and straightened it with careful hands. She stepped back, studying the faces frozen in time, and took a deep breath. The tears were right there, pressing behind her eyes, burning in her throat. But she wouldn't cry aloud. Not yet. Not while the night was still young and the house was listening. She whispered into the darkness, "What if this night isn't an ending? What if it's opening a door I can't see yet?" The crickets kept singing, the shingles kept creaking, and Margaret stood alone, waiting for an answer that didn't come. The sun rose over the farm like a promise nobody had asked for. Margaret woke before dawn, her body aching from a restless night on the old mattress that sagged in the middle. Rusty was already at the back door, whining softly to go out. She let him out and stood on the porch, watching the sky turn from deep purple to pink to gold. The air was cool and clean, carrying the smell of dew on grass and earth that had been baked by yesterday's sun. Her knees protested as she slowly lowered herself down onto the worn wooden boards of the porch, the same spot where she'd sat with Tom on summer evenings, where she'd bandaged the kids' scraped knees, where she'd shelled peas and snapped beans for 40 years. Now she knelt there alone. Margaret clasped her hands together, closed her eyes, and prayed. Not the long flowery prayers she'd heard in church services over the years, but something short and firm, words that came from a place deeper than her mind. "Lord," she whispered, "I'm old. My back hurts. My hands shake. I can't do this alone." She paused, feeling the truth of it settle in her chest. "But I'm still here, so if you've got a plan, I'm gonna need your wisdom. I'm gonna need your help. Show me what to do with what I've got left." She stayed there a moment longer, letting the morning wrap around her like a blanket, then opened her eyes and stood up slowly, gripping the porch railing for support. The farm spread out before her, overgrown fields, a sagging fence line, the old barn with its roof half caved in. It was too much, way too much for one old woman to handle, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to handle all of it. Margaret went inside and found an old notebook in the kitchen drawer, the kind with a faded blue cover that Tom used to use for keeping track of feed orders. Most of the pages were blank. She grabbed a pencil and sat down at the table. At the top of the first page, she wrote, "What I have." She started listing. Porch, still solid. Kitchen, works. Chicken coop, empty but fixable. Old seeds in the shed, might still grow. 3 cans of beans, half a bag of flour. Water from the well. Her hand moved steadily down the page. With each item, something shifted inside her. These weren't just things, they were possibilities. On the next page, she wrote, "What I can do. Organize, plan, ask for help." She underlined that last one twice. Pride had kept her silent for too long, pretending everything was fine when Robert and Sarah had started drifting away. But pride wouldn't feed her. Pride wouldn't fix the fence. Strategy, she realized, was its own kind of strength. She didn't have to lift heavy loads or work from dawn to dusk anymore, but she could think. She could plan. She could make what little she had go further. Margaret looked out the window at the rising sun, now fully above the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. She whispered to herself, to the empty room, to whatever force was listening, "Can a prayer really change the sky? And if the sky changes, does the earth have to follow?" Outside, Rusty barked once, sharp and clear, and somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed, announcing a new day, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Margaret was on the porch that afternoon, her blue notebook open on her lap, when she heard the rumble of an old pickup truck coming down the dirt road. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. The truck pulled up near the gate, and out stepped Henry Wallace, her neighbor from 2 miles down the road. He was carrying something wrapped in burlap, walking slow and careful like a man who knew what it meant to be invited and what it meant to intrude. "Mrs. Margaret," he called out, his voice warm but respectful. "Hope I'm not bothering you." "Henry," she stood up, gripping the porch railing. "You're not bothering me at all. Come on up." He climbed the porch steps and set the burlap bundle down gently. When he unwrapped it, Margaret saw a dozen corn seedlings, their roots wrapped in damp newspaper, fresh and green and full of life. "I was driving past this morning," Henry said, not quite meeting her eyes, "and I saw you. Well, I saw you kneeling out here, praying. And I don't know, Mrs. Margaret. Something just told me I should come by. Thought maybe you could use these." Margaret felt something catch in her throat. She looked at the seedlings, then at Henry's weathered face and nodded slowly. "I can use them. Thank you, Henry. Thank you so much." "It ain't much," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "But if you need help getting them in the ground, I can come back tomorrow, couple hours, that's all. I know you can't do the heavy work no more." "That would be a blessing," Margaret said softly. Henry tipped his hat and left, but the seedlings stayed, sitting there on the porch like a promise. The next morning, before Margaret had even finished her coffee, she heard another vehicle. This time it was Martha Simmons, a widow from the church, carrying a wooden crate with 3 rust-colored hens clucking inside. "Heard you might need some laying hens," Martha said with a shy smile. These girls are good producers. They'll give you eggs through the winter if you treat them right." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Martha, I don't know what to say. Don't say nothing, honey. Just take care of yourself. That's all any of us want." By noon, a young man named Danny Cooper showed up with an ox cart. "Mrs. Margaret, I heard Mr. Henry's bringing seedlings tomorrow. Thought you might could use this cart to haul water and supplies. I can lend it to you for as long as you need." Margaret stood on that porch, watching these people arrive one by one, and felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging kind, but the solid, rooted kind that comes from knowing you're not alone. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her blue notebook open. She turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Blessings received." Underneath, she listed each name: Henry Wallace, corn seedlings; Martha Simmons, 3 hens; Danny Cooper, ox cart. Next to each name, she wrote a short prayer. For Henry, Lord bless his fields and his family. For Martha, comfort her in her loneliness. For Danny, give him strength and wisdom. She made notes about the plans too. Henry would come for 2 hours in the morning. Danny would help move supplies in the afternoon. Short work days. Nothing backbreaking, just steady, simple progress. Margaret closed the notebook and looked out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, people were going about their lives, but here on this forgotten farm, something was starting to grow. She whispered into the quiet room, "If one spark can light a fire, what happens when a whole community catches flame?" Rusty lifted his head from his spot by the fireplace and thumped his tail once against the floor, as if he understood, as if he agreed. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. 3 weeks passed, and the farm began to transform. Henry Wallace came every morning like clockwork, bringing his tools and his quiet determination. The corn seedlings went into the ground in neat rows. Danny Cooper showed up with the ox cart, hauling water from the well, moving supplies, his young back strong and willing. Martha Simmons brought more than just those 3 hens. She brought her grandchildren, 2 little girls with braids and bright eyes who loved to help. They scattered chicken feed, pulled weeds, and filled the yard with laughter that Margaret hadn't heard in years. The fence got repaired, board by board. Other neighbors started showing up too. Old Man Peterson brought lumber. The Rodriguez family from the next county over heard about what was happening and donated packets of vegetable seeds. Even the pastor from the church stopped by with a basket of bread and preserves. Margaret coordinated it all from her porch, her blue notebook filling up with names and tasks and prayers. The yard was turning into a garden. The broken-down farm was becoming something alive again. She'd look out at those rows of green pushing up through the dark soil and feel something she thought she'd lost forever: purpose. But on a Thursday evening, just as the sun was starting to sink, the wind picked up. At first, it was just a breeze. Then it became something meaner, something with teeth. Dark clouds rolled in fast, turning the sky the color of a bruise. Margaret stood on the porch, watching, feeling that old familiar dread settle in her stomach. "Storm's coming," Henry said, securing tools in the shed. A bad one. And he was right. The wind hit like a freight train. Margaret huddled inside with Rusty, while the whole house shook. She could hear the shingles tearing loose from the roof, one after another flapping and crashing to the ground. Through the window, she watched the henhouse door blow open, and Martha's 3 hens scattered into the darkness, wings beating frantically. The garden rose she'd watched grow with such pride, those were getting torn apart, young plants ripped from the earth and tossed like they were nothing. When morning came, the damage was worse than she'd feared. Shingles littered the yard. The henhouse was half collapsed. 2 of the 3 hens were gone, probably carried off by foxes during the chaos. The garden looked like something had dragged its claws through it, leaving destruction in neat, cruel lines. Henry arrived at dawn and just stood there staring. Martha came next, her hand over her mouth. Danny showed up and kicked at a broken fence post, his shoulders sagging. "All that work," Martha whispered. "All for nothing." The words spread like poison. Margaret could see it in their faces, the discouragement, the defeat, the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Why keep trying? She sat in her chair on the porch, feeling every one of her 72 years pressing down on her bones. It would be so easy to quit, so easy to just let it all go. But then she thought about Robert and Sarah driving away, thought about that moment of abandonment, and she realized something. She'd survived that. She was still here. Margaret stood up slowly, gripping the porch railing, and called out in a voice that was calm but steady, carrying across the damaged yard. "Listen to me. All of you, listen." They turned to look at her. "If we fell together," she said, "then we rise together. This land isn't just mine, it's ours now. Every seed you planted, every nail you drove, that made it yours too. And we're not gonna let one storm take that away." She could see something shift in their eyes. "We need a plan," Margaret continued. "3 things. Replant what we can fast, build a real shelter for the animals, and reinforce that roof so it holds next time." Henry nodded slowly. "I can get more lumber." "I'll bring my son," Danny said. "He's good with hammering." Martha wiped her eyes. "I've got 2 more hens at home and we'll find those other ones." By mid-morning, twice as many people showed up as before. Word had spread about the storm, and folks came ready to work. Margaret sat on her porch watching them move through the yard with renewed purpose and whispered into the wind, "When the trial comes back stronger, does the answer have to be stronger too?" And somewhere deep inside, she already knew, yes, it does. The story spread like wildflowers after rain. People from neighboring towns started showing up at Margaret's farm, folks she'd never even met before. They came with pickup trucks loaded down with supplies, shingles for the roof, bags of seeds, jugs of water hauled from their own wells. "Heard about what you're doing here, ma'am," a farmer from 2 counties over said, tipping his hat. "Wanted to help if we could." Margaret stood on her porch, overwhelmed by the steady stream of kindness flowing toward her broken-down farm. Her blue notebook was filling up faster than she could write, names upon names, gifts upon gifts. And then something unexpected happened. One morning, a young mother arrived with her 3 children. "Mrs. Margaret," she said hesitantly, "I heard you know how to make a little go a long way. Could you teach me? My husband lost his job last month, and I don't know how we're going to make it through winter." Margaret looked at this young woman, couldn't have been more than 30, with tired eyes and work-worn hands, and she nodded. "Come on up here, honey, sit down." That afternoon, sitting on the porch with her notebook open, Margaret taught that young mother how to plan meals, how to stretch a dollar, how to preserve food for lean times. Other women heard about it and came the next day, then the next. Before long, Margaret's porch had become what folks started calling the life school. She taught home economy, not the fancy kind from textbooks, but the real kind learned from 40 years of making ends meet on a farm. She showed them how to care for chickens, how to start a garden with almost nothing, how to share fairly when resources were scarce. "It ain't about having plenty," Margaret would say, sitting in her chair with the afternoon sun warming her face. "It's about being wise with what you got, and knowing that what you got is always enough if you're willing to share it." The children who came with their parents started a project of their own. Danny Cooper brought a dozen young oak saplings, and the kids planted them in a row along the fence line. Each tree got a little wooden tag with a child's name carved into it. "This is our future," Martha's granddaughter said proudly, patting the dirt around her tree. "When we're old like Mrs. Margaret, these trees are going to be big and strong." Margaret watched those children work, their small hands in the soil, and felt something shift deep in her chest. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building something that would last. On Friday evening, as the sun started to set, someone suggested they have a little gathering. Nothing fancy, just folks sitting together in the yard, grateful for the week. They sang a simple hymn, Amazing Grace, their voices rising into the twilight. Margaret led a short prayer, thanking God for bringing people together, for turning loneliness into community, for showing that broken things could still grow. There was dignity in it, no spectacle, no show, just real people, real faith, real connection. What Margaret didn't know was that a reporter from the county newspaper had driven past the farm that week and written a small story. It got picked up by a radio station in the city. 200 miles away in a cramped apartment, Robert was driving home from another failed job interview when he heard it on the radio. In local news, an elderly woman abandoned by her family on a failing farm has sparked a movement of community support. Neighbors from across 3 counties have rallied to help 72-year-old Margaret. Robert's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His face went pale. That was his mother's name. That was his mother's farm. Across town, Sarah was at a cafe with friends when her phone buzzed. A text from someone she barely remembered. "Hey, isn't that your mom?" with a link to the news article. She opened it, read the first paragraph, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The cafe suddenly felt too loud, too bright. Her friends were laughing about something, but she couldn't hear them anymore. All she could hear was her own voice from months ago. "Figure it out alone, Ma." And now the whole world knew what they'd done. Margaret sat on her porch that evening, watching the last light fade from the sky, and whispered into the darkness, "When the light shines far enough, what does it show about the ones who ran from it?" She didn't know that miles away, her children were asking themselves the same question. Robert sat in his apartment, staring at the eviction notice taped to his door. 3 months. That's how long it had taken for everything to collapse. The business deal he'd been so sure about, the one that was going to make him rich, the one that was going to prove he didn't need the farm or his mother or anything from that old life, had fallen through. Turned out his business partner was nothing but a smooth talker with empty pockets and big promises. The money Robert had invested? Gone. Every dollar he'd saved, every cent he'd borrowed, vanished like smoke. And his friends, those guys he'd gone out drinking with, the ones who'd slapped him on the back and called him brother, they disappeared the moment he couldn't pick up the check anymore. Phone calls went unanswered, text messages left unread. He'd gone to his boss, hat in hand, asking for extra shifts. The answer was cold. "We're cutting back, Robert. Can't help you." Doors slammed shut everywhere he turned. Now he sat alone in the apartment that wouldn't be his much longer, eating ramen noodles for the 3rd night in a row, and feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the broken heater. It was the same cold he'd left his mother standing in, the same abandonment, the same silence. But his pride held on, stubborn and bitter. "I won't go back," he muttered to the empty room. "I won't crawl back to that farm like some kind of failure." Even as his stomach growled and his heart grew heavier by the hour, Sarah's fall was quieter, but just as brutal. She'd been dating Marcus for 6 months, a lawyer with a nice car and an apartment in the good part of town. He'd promised her a life she'd only dreamed about. Fancy restaurants, important parties, a world away from dirt roads and chicken coops. "You're gonna love these people," Marcus had said before they walked into the cocktail party. "Just maybe don't mention where you're from, okay? They can be a little particular." She'd laughed it off, but inside something had stung. At the party, she'd stood there in a dress she couldn't afford, holding a glass of wine she didn't like, listening to people talk about things she didn't understand, and when someone asked where she grew up, Marcus had jumped in before she could answer. "Oh, Sarah's from all over," he'd said smoothly. "Bit of everywhere, you know." The humiliation was subtle but sharp. He was ashamed of her, ashamed of where she came from. The relationship lasted another month before Marcus ended it over text. "I don't think this is working out. You're a great person, but we're just different, you know?" Sarah sat in her tiny studio apartment, the one she was barely affording on her receptionist salary, and felt the weight of loneliness press down on her like a physical thing. She'd traded her mother's love for the promise of something better, and what did she have to show for it? A closet full of clothes she'd bought on credit cards she couldn't pay off, friends who only called when they needed something, and an emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to her mother's contact, and stared at it for a long time. But pride whispered in her ear, "You can't go back now. You said you were done with that life. Going back would mean admitting you were wrong, that you failed." She put the phone down. 200 miles apart, both Robert and Sarah lay awake that night, staring at ceilings in apartments that didn't feel like home, feeling the same cold they'd inflicted on someone else. Robert remembered his mother's face when he'd said, "Figure it out alone." The way her hands had trembled, the way she'd looked so small standing on that porch. Sarah remembered climbing into the car without looking back. The weight of guilt she'd pushed down and tried to forget. Now that guilt was rising up again, heavier than before, how long could pride last before it turned into something else? Before it became a cry for help that nobody would hear? They didn't know the answer yet, but they were starting to learn that some lessons only come through suffering, and some roads only lead you back to where you started, if you're lucky enough to find your way home. It was a grey Tuesday afternoon when Margaret heard the soft knock on the gate. She was on the porch with Henry and Martha, planning next week's planting schedule, when she looked up and saw him standing there. Robert, her son, thinner than she remembered, his shoulders hunched, his face carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. He didn't call out, didn't announce himself, just stood there, one hand on the gate, like he wasn't sure he had the right to open it. Margaret felt her heart lurch in her chest. She stood slowly, gripping the porch railing, and walked down the steps. Henry and Martha watched in silence. She reached the gate and looked at her son through the metal bars. He'd aged in these months. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His hands trembled slightly. "Ma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret opened the gate without a word. She didn't rush forward to embrace him, didn't throw her arms around him like nothing had happened. Instead, she stepped aside and let him through. "Come up to the porch," she said quietly. "I'll get you some water." They walked in silence, Robert following behind her like a stranger. She poured him a glass from the pitcher on the porch table and handed it to him. He took it with shaking hands and drank like a man who'd been walking through a desert. The silence between them said everything. The apology that hadn't been spoken yet, the shame weighing on his shoulders, the pain still raw in her heart. Henry cleared his throat. "Mrs. Margaret, we should probably—" "Stay," Margaret said firmly. "Please." But not everyone was as gracious. By evening, word had spread that Robert was back. Some folks in the community weren't happy about it. The next morning, when people gathered for the usual work, Old Man Peterson spoke up, his voice hard. "I don't mean disrespect, Mrs. Margaret, but that boy abandoned you, left you here to figure it out alone, and now he shows up when you've built something? When there's food on the table again?" Others murmured in agreement. "Who plants abandonment and expects to harvest forgiveness?" someone said. The tension hung thick in the air. Robert stood off to the side, his face burning with shame, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Margaret raised her hand, and the yard fell silent. "This isn't a courthouse," she said, her voice calm but steel-edged. "And I'm not asking any of you to forgive what you didn't suffer. That's between me and my son. But this is still my farm, and he's still my child. And if I say he stays, he stays." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but nobody argued. Margaret's word carried weight now. 5 days later, another knock came, this time at night. Margaret opened the door to find Sarah standing there, mascara smeared down her cheeks, clutching a suitcase that looked too light to hold much of anything. Her daughter was holding back tears, her whole body trembling. "Mama," Sarah whispered, and the word broke something open in both of them. Margaret didn't hesitate this time. She pulled her daughter inside, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and led her to the kitchen table. She heated up soup, the same vegetable soup the community had been sharing all week, and set it in front of Sarah. Sarah tried to speak, tried to apologize, but the words wouldn't come, just tears. Margaret sat across from her and waited. When Sarah finally looked up, Margaret spoke, her voice gentle but honest. "It hurt," she said simply. "What you did, what both of you did, it hurt more than I can say." Sarah's face crumpled. "I know. I'm so sorry, Mama. I know you are, honey." Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "And I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean we pretend it didn't happen. It means we're gonna work through it, together." Sarah nodded, tears streaming freely now. Later that night, Margaret sat on the porch with both her children inside, finally under her roof again. Robert was sleeping on the couch. Sarah was in her old bedroom, and Margaret whispered into the darkness, "Forgiveness ties the bonds again. But how do you stitch trust that's been torn? How long does that take?" She didn't have the answer yet, but she knew this much. Healing would require more than words. It would require time and work, and the willingness to stay even when staying was hard. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. Margaret called a meeting on the porch 3 days after Sarah arrived. The whole community gathered: Henry, Martha, Danny, Old Man Peterson, the Rodriguez family, and a dozen others who'd become part of this makeshift family. Robert and Sarah stood in the center, facing everyone. Margaret sat in her chair, her blue notebook closed on her lap. "We're gonna do this right," Margaret said. "Not hidden away, not swept under the rug, out here with witnesses." The air was thick with tension. Robert looked down at his feet. Sarah twisted her hands together nervously. Margaret spoke first, her voice steady. "Robert, Sarah, you need to tell the truth, not excuses. Just truth." Robert lifted his head, his voice rough. "I chose to leave. I chose to turn my back when you needed me most. I told myself it was because of old hurts, because I wanted something better. But the truth is I was selfish. And I hurt you, Ma. I hurt you bad." Sarah's voice cracked when she spoke. "I was ashamed of where I came from. I wanted to be someone different, someone impressive. So I abandoned you. I climbed in that car and didn't look back, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. No excuses, no justifications, just raw, painful truth." Margaret nodded slowly. "And what are you going to do about it?" "Whatever it takes," Robert said. "I'll work every day. I'll help fix what's broken, plant what needs planting. No shortcuts. Just steady service until I've earned back what I threw away." "Same here," Sarah added. "I'll help with the cooking, the cleaning, the teaching. Whatever you need, Mama, for as long as it takes." Margaret stood up then, walked over to her children, and looked them both in the eyes. "I forgive you," she said simply. "I'm still your mother. That doesn't change. But forgiveness doesn't mean there aren't consequences. You want to stay here. You respect this community. You show up on time. You work hard. You're honest, even when it hurts. Those are my boundaries. Yes, ma'am, they said together. Henry spoke up from the crowd. We'll hold them to it, Mrs. Margaret. We'll make sure. And they did. The next morning, Robert was up before dawn, sweeping the yard. His back bent over the broom like he was trying to sweep away months of shame along with the dust. Sarah fetched water from the well, her arms shaking under the weight of the buckets. But she didn't complain. She just kept walking, kept carrying. They showed up on time every day, every task. No matter how small, no matter how hard, forgiveness had opened the door. But walking through it, that was a different story. That required feet willing to move, hands willing to work, hearts willing to change. Margaret watched from the porch, her notebook open, adding new entries. Not just tasks this time, but small victories. Robert fixed the henhouse door. Sarah taught the children a new song, and she whispered to herself, forgiveness is a door, but who's willing to walk the path beyond it? Her children were walking it now, step by painful step, and that, Margaret knew, was all anyone could ask. 6 months passed, not in a blur, but in the slow, steady rhythm of real change. Robert proved himself through action. He coordinated a cistern project with Mr. Peterson, who'd been a builder in his younger days. Every detail went into Margaret's blue notebook. Materials needed, work schedules, costs. They held accountability meetings on the porch every Friday morning, the whole community watching the progress. When Robert made mistakes, showed up late once, forgot to order supplies another time, he owned it immediately. I messed up. I'm sorry. I'll fix it. No excuses, just truth. Sarah ran the community kitchen with the same determination. She created weekly rotation schedules, kept supply lists, made sure nothing went to waste. She mentored young folks who came to learn, teaching them the same lessons Margaret had taught her on that porch months ago. Both of them kept steady routines. Punctuality became their signature. Unseen service, sweeping before anyone woke up, fixing things before anyone asked, became their language of love. The farm transformed too. They formalized it, called it Hope Homestead, posted rules on a board by the gate: respect, service, honesty, community. A planting calendar hung in the kitchen. Welcome shifts rotated weekly, so everyone had a chance to greet newcomers. And those oak saplings the children had planted, they were growing strong, their little name tags weathered but still readable. On a Saturday evening in late autumn, the community gathered for a celebration under the biggest oak tree, the one that had stood on this land longer than anyone could remember. They sang hymns as the sun set, their voices rising into the cooling air. Margaret stood in the center, flanked by Robert and Sarah, surrounded by dozens of people who'd become family. Then, as they started singing Amazing Grace, the first drops of rain began to fall. Heavy, cleansing rain, the kind the farm had been praying for. Some folks looked up, expecting everyone to run for cover, but nobody moved. They kept singing, their voices strong and clear as the rain came down harder. Margaret raised her hands to the sky, her face turned upward, tears mixing with rainwater streaming down her weathered cheeks. Robert put his arm around her shoulders. Sarah held her hand. When the hymn ended, Margaret spoke, her voice carrying across the yard despite the rain. Where my strength failed, faith remained. Where my arms lacked, God sent people. This is what we built together, not me alone, never alone. The community erupted in cheers, rain-soaked and laughing and crying all at once. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Margaret sat on the porch with her blue notebook. The rain had stopped, leaving everything fresh and clean. She wrote on the last page, "From abandonment to community, from ruin to root, this is what's possible when we choose hope." And then she closed the book and whispered into the night air, knowing somehow that her story would reach beyond this farm, beyond these fields, to touch someone somewhere who needed to hear it. What downfall in your life needs to turn into a new beginning? What seed are you willing to plant today? The stars came out, bright and endless. And on Hope Homestead, everything was finally beautifully whole. Margaret's story shows us something powerful. No matter how broken we feel, no matter who walks away, we can rebuild. But here's the real question. Are you waiting for someone else to save you, or are you willing to plant that first seed yourself? Think about it. How many times have you let pride keep you from asking for help? How many times have you abandoned your own dreams because someone told you they weren't good enough? Margaret didn't have money, strength, or even her own children by her side, but she had faith, a notebook, and the courage to start. What's stopping you? And here's the part that might sting a little. If Robert and Sarah could swallow their pride and come home, who do you need to forgive? Who do you need to ask forgiveness from? Real transformation doesn't happen in comfort. It happens when we face the truth, take responsibility, and show up every single day, even when it's hard. So I'm asking you directly, what seed are you planting today? What broken part of your life is waiting to become your greatest legacy? Write it in the comments. Don't just watch this story and move on. Let it change you. Let it challenge you. Let it push you to build your own hope homestead wherever you are. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that could change your perspective. And right now, click on the video appearing on your screen, because there's another powerful journey waiting for you. Someone out there needs to hear these stories. Someone needs hope. Will you share it with them? Go ahead. Click. Your next transformation starts now.